Hello and welcome to the Buzz Corner with us. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Buzz Corner with all of us tonight. My name is Andrea. This is my sign name, and we're going to talk about racism and Audism in our topics tonight. So take it away.
And hello, everybody. My name is Bucky, formerly known as the Queen Bee of Linguabee, and I am looking forward to our discussion tonight.
Yes, tonight our topics are very, very engaging with racism and Audism, delving deep down, talking about interpreters as well as the deaf community and how we navigate those two topics. So we have a guest speaker with us tonight. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Hello, thank you so much for having me here today. My name is Romduol. I go by Rom, and I just want to describe myself. I have a dark blue background. I'm light brown skin with short black hair. I have a gray shirt on with blue sleeves. And the topic I'm talking about tonight will be racism and Audism everywhere. And I do know that that's a very hot topic lately with many of the catastrophes that have been going on. And I will not be naming names and going into details because the community has already taken care of all of that. I just want to talk about actions and impacts and how it does correlate with racism and Audism. I do want to share one of my quotes that I find as a favorite and give you some context and look at it. The quote is, "We all do experience racism. However, we can also oppress people." Interpreter clarification. We can experience oppression, but we can also oppress. And so we had a situation where there was a hearing interpreter who was African American in Coda and had a specific behavior that exhibited autism because they'd taken away the opportunity by a deaf person with a one-man show, was quite well known. Their opportunity was stolen. And with ASL, they're not the only particular characters, but we have to notice the Audism and what might have been experienced, the challenges. And it seems as if the world as a whole would rather work with hearing people, and they think that it can save them money, it'll save them time because they don't have to accommodate. If they have a hearing interpreter, it'd be so much easier to work with them and giving them much more opportunity, whereas a deaf interpreter, they do struggle. So we're looking at the two different areas of racism and Audism. And this is not a singular case. There is multiple. And I want you to all keep that in mind before we get into further discussion. And I don't want anybody getting overly emotional about this, but the key is holding people accountable for their actions. Maybe say, did you do this with other interpreters in the past, with other people who might have made mistakes? For example, if you take a look at the behavior in the past, typically you may, just call something out in general. Maybe if it's a Black or brown interpreter that may have made an error, then that error spreads like wildfire, where somebody might say a sexual joke and make fun of things. Those types of things get very much exploited. And, even though there's telling jokes that could be racist, talking about, Black people are compared to being monkeys, and all of those various layers of things with racism. And, that doesn't necessarily mean anti-Blackness. There's other examples like with RID and Jonathan Webb, where there was so much drama that led him to want to step down from the board. And, that gave me a lot of mixed emotions. And I myself was involved, but for various reasons, not that because I was involved with the BIPOC Deaf Interpreters Group. We shared our frustrations with racism and Audism and trying to figure out how to navigate through that. And then we had a white person step in and make all sorts of comments, which were horrible. And so that's where you see the news go crazy. It's more talked about. And I think there was a year or two ago, there was the Black Coda who did the pledge, Andrea, the Pledge of Allegiance. And I could understand her fine. There were no errors, there was nothing unclear whatsoever in her presentation. I completely understood. I mean, yes, I thought maybe it would have been Black ASL or grassroots, but I wasn't a professional to, well enough to discern that. But the criticisms that came out of that, so many people had the nerve to say, "Oh, she's a fake coda. That's how she signs." And I thought, And then trying to take a look at the White House situation, where there was a white coda interpreter by the I'm not going to say the name, a white coda, and was interpreting for the White House, and I wouldn't say was outstanding, but people did make conversation about her and some complaints, but there was a lot more support for her as a coda, even though I can't necessarily say that her signing was so far uh, different than the one who did the Star Spangled Banner. And I think we need to hold people accountable, but you have to take a look at your past behaviors. Be sure that if you're going to treat someone a certain way, it has to be equal, and not look at finding like severe consequences for things. The punishment should align with the violation or the action. So I just wonder, Andrea, what are your thoughts about the different points that I brought up?
Well, like you mentioned, this is so complex. I don't believe there's one answer, but this is just a very layered topic. And so I believe that there's not just one solution. The concept of audism and ableism, I believe a lot of people sometimes are thinking of the negativity behind movies and film and various social media. But now we're looking at the deaf community. How do we handle that? How do we really stop that? It can be very, very challenging in our community to, hold ourselves accountable. And we do that, but also there can be extremes as well, which are sometimes unnecessary. At the same time, you have to remember that some people are coming from a place of trauma. And so that informs them as well. And so sometimes that happens with interpreters as well, that it can impact their decisions. So can we distinguish audism and racism from each other? I believe it's so, so difficult. The interpreter that you mentioned who took a deaf person's job, that really does impact us. But it can be very, very difficult to separate those two, I have to admit. And so that's why I think it's super important to have an authentic conversation about what's going on regarding both of those topics at the same time.
I very much agree with that. And I had to also recognize within myself that racism and autism there's so many other isms that are out there, sexism as an example, but oftentimes we might forget that, we feel that we're the victims of oppression, but we also oppress those in exchange. And so in our actions, we are also maybe unknowingly oppressing others. And that's something we need to recognize. And yes, we can feel violated, but then ask ourselves, how do we respond to that situation? Do I perpetuate that system of oppression, or am I going to support well-being and healthy discussions, and how do we work together and navigate through all this? And it is extremely complex. You're right. It's not just one layer. You can't just peel off one and then it's done and everything's great. We have to consider all the intersectionality in this.
Perfectly put. I agree with that.
Absolutely. So talking about intersectionality and looking at the consequences of actions taken by these interpreters, but how do we gauge that short term and long term, right? Looking at intersectionality, for example, myself as a white person, I may perceive a consequence differently as opposed to a Black person who is involved in a situation, and you have a perspective from a Black
person. Right.
So
And
again,
you may feel like that there's an injustice being done, right?
I'm so glad you said that, because I almost forgot when we were talking about penalties. Yes, very much so. So I did make a comment, and then I also have done some research based on criminal justice and equality or lack thereof in the courts. and that Black people tend to have much harsher consequences. So that led me to really think about, and envision. So if a person who was punished equally, regardless of race, and maybe if they did the same type of crime or violation and they look at a white person and they give them a certain level of punishment, and that should apply to all. You just can't have that bias, the racial bias that, people of color get much harsher sentences. I wonder if, making that type of suggestion would work. And I think that's something we need to solve.
Yeah, I was thinking, you may have a Black pool of interpreters and then you've got a white interpreter as well. And, one interpreter may be white and sign a rap song, and the community would blast them on social media, but
yes,
they wouldn't be punished, right? There would be no consequence after that.
Mm-hmm.
So is that equal to a Black interpreter doing something like that? Would the same thing happen? Can we measure them the same? I think it requires more than just one conversation. It's an ongoing dialogue that we have to have. The community, at the community level, we have to really invest in this conversation. And like you said, oppressed people can oppress others, and we can oppress ourselves. So we have to look at what is possible and what is just. And it can be very, very difficult to have that frank and honest conversation. Yeah, Bucky, you want to say something?
Yeah, I think a challenge from at least the agency standpoint is, you mentioned recently the rap and the interpreter providing that service and, doing this rap. And if an agency, well, actually two components here. So if the requester, for example, requests a specific interpreter who is not Black, do we as an agency adhere to the request and provide this specific service provider? Or the second thing to think about is, as an agency reaches out and looks for the interpreter, there are some agencies that don't quite have the appropriate connections within the community or the network, and therefore are not going to find the best fit. So the question is, the assignment needs coverage. Do we provide what we have and provide the white interpreter, or do we decline the assignment? It's really a continuum that we have to constantly think about.
Again, as we said, this is a very complex issue, and we don't have a one-step solution. And I think the key is we really have to look back at the source. And does it come with training? Does it come with screening? Like, for example, in an IEP or ITP, are there very many Black people brown people who get involved? And you're seeing the numbers of people who drop out of these programs and those who stay. And it could be because of the oppression that occurs. Maybe specifically Black, and I believe some brown too, but more so with the Black interpreters. If they do something wrong, it's talked about, it's blown up, and then can you imagine how they feel and their response being different to a white person who might just brush it off and just keep on moving. And so I think the response is not the same. I think it's not just, and it's a really difficult challenge. And I also have done much more platform interpreting, including music. And I realized that there's mentorships and trainings and things that are there. And when there are struggles that might happen, although there are very many, I know that with white hearing interpreters, they have access to the mentorship. They've got more opportunities where I didn't have the same. And I questioned myself, should I continue? I didn't feel so confident. So I think we have to really look back and dig deep into where the root of the problem is and where it first began. And if that part was to get changed, the impact would also change. But it's really hard for us to discover what the source is until we really, really look at the true situation.
So I want to add to that, Rom, and then also talk about Bucky's perspective from an agency. We have the community perspective and then we have the agency perspective, right? And so there's not one size fits all. Right. I believe that we need to take a pulse as an agency on the situation. And you can't just say, oh, I have to follow the customer's request. Is that moral? Are we able to put the interpreter in that situation, even if they're at risk? just because the customer asked for that? What would the community say? Would it harm them? Would it oppress them? Would it cause trauma? So think about that assignment. We have to look at what the community needs as well, not just what the agency or the interpreter needs, and look at ourselves too. So that helps us to find the best answer, you know? And then of course the favorite comment is, it always depends.
And to dovetail on that, it is about getting the sense of things, having interpreters that care about the community. And what about the agencies? Are they more concerned about profit as opposed to the community? And they don't care who they put in front of the audience. They just want to make the money, and what the impact is maybe is irrelevant to them. So the key is finding out, but you're right. There is no one size fits all. Absolutely not.
And I want to go back also to the original comment that we talked about, having more a harsher reaction for interpreters of color. We talked about racism, but I also want to talk about audism and the impact on the deaf community, how severe that can be, that interpreters do cause that sense of oppression, right? And it's very real. And like I mentioned before, it comes from a place of trauma, and it is real. It does happen to the community, and we need to hold space for the interpreters. Sometimes I don't think a lot of us do that. We don't have that type of space for the interpreter because we live in a hearing world. We confront this all the time, and now we have to hold space for hearing people. How do we engage with that conversation?
You're right. I agree, and that is the challenge, because it's not just because of interpreters. We've got so many life experiences. For example, myself, I'm light brown, I'm Khmer, I'm deaf, plus I'm transgender or gender fluid, and I look at all of the impact that occurs on my multiple layers, and then interpreting. I have to take the information, go through my own filters, and see how that impacts me as an individual. Now, I've always felt a little disappointed, I must say, because I recognize even within myself that over time, I've been so much of an advocate for interpreters and our people and our community, the Black and Brown community. I've been very, very supportive. But when it was time to get support from those groups of people, I never found it. So I am standing up for you, but when I need you, where are you?
That is so true.
And then people are saying, oh, well, it's because of my experience with oppression. I try to avoid those kinds of things. And I said, wait a minute. I can't say I've experienced the same, but yes, we have different layers of experiential oppression, but you can't just say, well, I'm not going to be involved. I'm going to stay right here in my lane. And that makes it really difficult for us to hold space for people when you don't feel like or trust that they will do the same for me instead. And I think that's where interpreter groups, including deaf interpreters now, because we are participating, we are aware.
And we're part of that, right?
We have to figure out to stop perpetuating that trauma and not continuing that power shift or power imbalance. That's something that we need to find an answer to. And that's tough. I mean, it's still a very new experience. I can't come up and say, here, I have the answer, but it's something to look forward to in the future. And in this talk of audism, now my experience as a deaf interpreter, it's been tough, really.
I'm sure.
Not just of audism, but I get double, triple, quadruple layers because of my identity. For example, someone had put out a vlog. Now, at first I thought nothing of it. And my face was a 5-second pop in. I said 1 or 2 lines, which was not a big deal. The rest of the time it was deaf people providing the information in sign, but people were saying, oh, congratulations. They thought I was part of that company, that I was working for them. And oh, what a success for you in this program. And I thought, I wasn't having a problem with this because of the video, but because of the comments and how the video was presented. For example, in the video, the comment said something to the effect of, oh, I'm so thrilled to have this program with 37 people participating. and 77% of them are minorities, and 5% were Black and brown or BIPOC, and then 11% are deaf. So there were only 4 deaf individuals there, including myself. And I still are in touch with the other 2 out of the 3. And then the 4th, I was in touch with, and then we've just lost touch, and I don't understand. I don't know whatever happened with that. But, we talked about diversity and inclusion, but I felt like they were overusing those statements. I felt as if, they were talking about diversity and inclusion. But my question is, well, wait a minute. How many of you will actually hire a person in this company, meeting these 4 people that we worked with? None of us got interviewed. I did. But I must say, I was working hard. I contacted them consistently. I followed up. I kept nudging people, going round and round. And it was my assertiveness that got me the interview. And there were 3 that I had to take. I passed 2 out of the 3. And let me tell you, I was stunned. There were, a few interviews. The first interview, they were saying, well, we don't really need deaf interpreters because the request doesn't happen in this area. And they're giving me all this blah, blah, blah. And I thought, whoa, hold on a second. This is a bias, like right here in front of my face. And then the second time, I was also thinking, my gosh, what the nerve. It was a deaf interpreter that kept emphasizing, well, I graduated from Gallaudet, but looking at the sign production, I felt that they were using the words Gallaudet to maybe be impressive. And so questioning, is my signing equal, and they're talking about, are you able to work with deaf people? Could you pretend to be a deaf consumer? And, they try to pretend to be a deaf person, but the key was that they were being grassroots. But the sign for grassroots here is not the same. And oh man, I have a lot of feelings about that word, let me tell you. But that really struck me because there are a lot of deaf people who work there, not as interpreters, but employees in the company in different positions. So why not have a real deaf person in this interview rather than a person pretending to be deaf? That makes no sense to me. And, to me, that was a clear case of autism, and that hearing interpreters are gatekeepers and kind of keeps us from getting equal opportunities, for getting work in the community. And yeah. Go ahead, Bucky.
Yeah, I have to just kind of zone in on that concept of gatekeeping, right? You have to think about the days before RID, the days before ADA, and we had such a strong, robust deaf community, right? We worked together to determine who was qualified and who was not. And then, of course, over the years, we have laws, we have standards, and now we have many agencies. And I think these agencies have a tremendous role in terms of navigating that power shift, in terms of who makes it through those gates, those interpreters who are going through these agencies. And really, we have to push that power back over onto the deaf community.
I agree. It's agencies, it's the training programs. There's many different roles out there that perpetuate that idea that hearing interpreters know best. They have the best judgment, even with the training. And some people might say, oh, well, I graduated from Gallaudet. And for hearing people, they find that to be brownie points and automatically assign that person as an expert, even though they're a fresh graduate. There's nobody who's going to be an expert because, nobody has lived all of those experiences.
I agree with that. I think interpreters right now are a different breed, just to be honest. We have a whole different breed than we did 20 years ago. 20 years ago, interpreters were building through the community, it was not phone or social media. It was in person being there, and now people are just going into the interpreting training program just saying, I want to learn sign language, but they don't know anybody deaf.
Yep.
Online. They're learning online.
Exactly. So it's that Audist mentality that's being cultivated. And so that contributes to those type of people being in the interpreting field. But how do we get it back to the original deaf community? It's going to be so
Oh,
hard to
yeah.
make that shift, to go back to interpreters with deaf heart, to help the deaf community grow. I
Yes.
feel like that is an Audist mentality that's part of the interpreting field right now. And it's engrossed in the field more than I would like to admit. I know that we say it's not, but when we look, it's so hard to dig out that Audist mentality. And it's really up to the interpreters, which goes back to the chaotic situation that just happened, the interpreter that took over an acting role that was supposed to be given to a deaf actor. So we have to think about that.
I completely understand what you're saying. However, I do think it's important, yes, talking about their experiences growing up, the challenges that they may have faced in their communities. But you can't say that all codas and godas are the same.
I'm
Um,
definitely not saying that for sure.
I'm not saying you are, but some people do send me messages and saying, "Oh, I was so shocked. I thought they would have done better." And and I'm seeing these messages, and I have to remind people that it's not a monolith. I did give one really good example, say with an accident. People have experienced an accident, they will respond differently. Some jump up and move on as if they're fine. Some people are very traumatized. Some people never drive again. So if you take a look at that comparison, not everyone will respond the same to a similar incident. And so if you're looking at a coda and a goda, they're not always very supportive, because a lot of people forget about Alexander Graham Bell, who was one of our worst oppressors in history, who was a coda.
That's the point. That's the point. That's what I'm talking about, is that Audist mentality that's ingrained in
Agreed.
society. It's ingrained. Whether you were raised with deaf people or not, you still have that privilege. You still have that thinking and that mentality, which goes to my point. I think with that specific situation, people were thinking more about the language rights than the actual privilege in that situation. Who had the privilege?
True, true, yes. And that needs to be recognized.
And someone saying, well, I know ASL, it's my language, I was raised with deaf family members, but you're failing to recognize the privilege that you have that impacts that situation. Like you said in the very, very beginning, hearing people will say, oh, well, or, let me just hire a person that's hearing that knows sign, because it's a lot less work than hiring a deaf person. So hearing
Right.
people have that privilege, period. They all do. And I think interpreters need to recognize, anytime you go into a job interview or any type of deaf profession with any deaf clients in whatever setting, you have to recognize the privilege that you have. And that can impact the situation. They're going to look to you as the hearing person for the answer. They're going to value your opinion as a hearing person more than the deaf clients. So if we're talking about autism and racism, they are very parallel topics. How do we
Yes.
handle them as we move through society?
I think that that's a very important question, that they do work in tandem. And how do we break away from that? But there's really no answer. There's no workshop you can take, and once you take it, you get your certificate, and that means you know everything, and okay, you're a better person for it. But no, it's a lesson you learn throughout life, and that's an unfortunate piece, that some individuals, are they willing to go ahead and really take a look deep into who they are and their
And do
behavior?
the work. You're right. They
They're
have to
gonna
be willing
have
to
to
do the
do it.
work.
That's why we can talk and talk and talk, but people can't just stand up one day and say, "Oh, I'm a better person for this." No, this is going to be ongoing. There's no end to this.
And so, one thing that I think might be worth us noting and perhaps benefit us in terms of growth and just getting better, just one experience that has nothing directly related to autism. However, it does definitely involve racism. And so I do not tend to watch the NFL. I don't follow it. Periodically, I do watch it. But recently, there was a black quarterback, Colin Kaepernick, right? Yes. And so he kneeled during the national anthem, and how he was treated by the NFL was horrendous. He was the starting quarterback for the Super Bowl. Unfortunately, they lost, but you know, it was just overnight. He became a nobody within the span of just a couple of years. Wasn't even good enough to be on the second or back line. They had multiple quarterbacks that they allocated before him. And so I made a decision to not contribute to the NFL by stopping to watch it. I don't watch it at all. And that's a decision that I have made. And so I know a Black interpreter who loves to go to the NFL. And so we were talking at a conference last year, and he told me essentially to let it go. And I said, well, but the NFL, they've made these decisions, and he indicated to me that they've improved, right? They've made some changes. And so, interestingly enough, I'm creating another layer, another problem by refusing to engage and refusing to pay attention to the improvements and to those changes, which means that I am contributing to a lack of conversation. And I think that sort of shadows what we need to be thinking about here in our community, right?
Yeah,
Instead of
that's right.
writing the interpreter off, we need to get together, we need to have these conversations. And it is quite possible that we may have interpreters who are belligerent and unwilling. And then, of course, after so many attempts to rectify the situation, we move on. And so, of course, we need to unpack. We need to invest time into these conversations. We need to become better people. We need to eliminate, to the best of our ability, the racism, the audism, and the
Yes.
layers within us. Just felt like I should mention that.
Yes, go ahead, Andrea.
And
Go
Rom,
ahead.
you want to say something? No, go ahead. I wanted to say about what Bucky was talking about, the NFL and that whole kerfuffle and how the cancel culture is out there. And I believe the whole point of tonight is to avoid cancel culture, right? That's the point. Cancel culture is becoming such, within the last few years, it's really taken over everything and it's impacting the culture. So it's not benefiting anyone. Call in, sit down, call out. And so again, it comes back to how much do we hold space and how much do we give that to other people?
Right.
For example, your friend, the interpreter, who is a person of color themselves, is still supporting the NFL. And so they have the emotional ability to still move on past that tragedy, whereas some people can't. They can't watch the NFL anymore. I really believe it's up to the community to decide what culture to cancel and what that should actually look like. And then how many people can we hold space for at that trauma level? So that's just what I wanted to say.
Yeah, and that was planning. I was just about to say the same thing.
Great minds think alike.
Yes, I wanted to also call out, the having healthy transformative transformation, and that focuses more on healing and how we can support growth. And the goal should be to grow and change and not to shut yourself out of it and just cancel culture, as you mentioned, because then you lose that type of advocacy. You're losing the opportunities to benefit and grow if you completely separate yourself, but then how much can we hold space for? There could be considerations of trauma, and we could have that sit down conversation, but at whose expense? Is it ours? And so I think that the key is depending on the person who can and is willing to have that open dialogue and make that connection, and not just people who do it for their job, but I think they might be willing to do the work, and they may be the best fit for us. But for us, everyday people, I think it really all depends. We might need to check in, see if a person is willing and open to this. So again, it depends. There's so many layers. Once again, it makes it really difficult.
And I was thinking about racism and audism and how ingrained they are in our system, in our society. It's not going to go away overnight, but I think that it's important individually to do the work, and people who cause harm and people who receive harm, who are the receiving end of it, need to have that discussion, right? In order to see what healing looks like. And that the community needs to be held accountable to be part of that conversation. As a community, the person who's caused harm needs to admit that, yes, I have done something, and be willing to accept their potential of causing harm in the work that they do, like the interpreter that we mentioned. And the deaf interpreter who may have experienced vicarious trauma because of that oppression is now part of that too. So it's important for everyone to remember it's an ongoing conversation. It's not something that you can discuss one time and then put in a box.
And that's my point of this topic, that we do also experience oppression, but then in turn, we do also oppress. Therefore, even though we have been oppressed, look at the day and time that we live in. People are always saying, well, look at what happened to me. Look, I'm the victim. And then what about the reaction? They're overlooking that part of the process. You have to think before you jump into what you believe is the solution.
That big picture piece, yes.
And yes, I may have experienced trauma, but now I have to figure out, how does my trauma, because I don't want my trauma to become your trauma, and I don't want to place it on other people and just perpetuate more and more trauma on others. You know what I mean? So I think that's where I have to have the courage, and that's hard for us. And I think, it's a starting place. That's the first step.
I really enjoyed this conversation. I feel like there's so much to unpack. It's almost like peeling back the layers of an onion. And so I kind of want to turn it over to the audience. What are your thoughts? What are your feelings with your comments? Do you disagree? That's totally your right to do that. We're here to have a real conversation. And if we can open the conversation and change the way the interpreting field interacts with the deaf community. If you have any questions, feel free to go ahead and type them in the Q&A. I would love to hear from the audience. And you can also raise your virtual hand. That's fine. Feel free to do that. We can allow you to come on screen and ask that question as well, if you don't want to just type it in the chat. So feel free to engage with us.
And while we're waiting for those virtual hands and or comments in the chat, that situation in regards to the debacle with an interpreter who essentially robbed a deaf person of an opportunity, that particular situation, as it has happened, the question remains, what is the best way to approach this situation? Right?
Whom?
For the
and
deaf
who are we referring to? Who?
For the deaf person who is immediately involved, and then of course for the interpreter, right? So we know that a post was made on social media. It was spread very quickly. Let's look at the viability of that response. And now looking at the interpreter who took a defensive approach to their response. And now we have to ask, what is the best approach? What is the most healthy next step? And so maybe your answer, of course, is different from the next person, but I do think that we have to sort of, we have to think about what's reasonable. What is reasonable action? What is a reasonable response for that behavior and their response in terms of defending themselves?
Well, like you said, there's no one correct answer. There's no one way. In my view, I don't feel like that person was wrong in their response, the deaf person that is. I mean, unfortunately, there's a pattern, and that could have really become the actual problem. And I don't know if they did something different, whether it would have been too much different as a response, but I just mention it because, many of us, we've never lived their lives. We never walked in the shoes. We don't know where their feelings and response may have been triggered from. And so we have to consider the context, the community, the people, the history. And sometimes people just get fed up after an accumulation of all of these frustrations, went ahead and put out a post. Now, mind you, we don't know what happened before that and what triggered that response. So now we're looking at how this person is defending themselves. And I feel very strongly that Audism was engaged in some of these comments. And do we condone that kind of behavior about maybe gaslighting somebody, for example, and, going around and telling the whole community, hey, can you respond to that post, and say that, that's being a call out of sorts is really what it was, but people were saying, no, it's just harassment, and saying, oh, no, that's false. But it's about trying to get into people's head and saying, oh, this guy is fake. What he's saying is not true, and trying to gaslight the situation. And it's not right for us to do that. But what is the best approach? That's the big question. And Andrea, what do you think?
I agree with your example and what you just mentioned. And I think it comes from a place of using the hearing privilege to oppress the deaf person. My word has more value than theirs. And I believe that's what was experienced in this situation. And I have some friends who did reach out to him and they DM'd him and they said, is this story true? And he was very defensive and not willing to engage with them and be called out. And even in public and in private, he's being very defensive.
Right.
With his responses. So I think the best thing with whoever causes the harm in any situation needs to say, okay, time out, take a step back. Let me process what just happened and then make a response. Don't be overly defensive and put your head in the sand where you can't even think clearly to make a response to the allegations. So that response showed who they am. The best thing that you can do is not to immediately respond and immediately delete the post and then react, but that's from a place of panic, right? And it's fine that you're panicking in the moment, but then hear the deaf community, take it in, listen to what's being said, and say, you know what? In this situation, I could have done better. I could have done better. Instead of saying, I didn't do that and being overly defensive, you're not taking responsibility. Take accountability. Receive that feedback that you could do better going forward. And we didn't see that response.
So I have to say, how do you respond when this individual feels that they truly did not do anything wrong?
And I think it's their privilege. They have their head in the sand. They can't even see what they did.
I'm sorry, go ahead, Rom.
Well, no, I think Andrea hit the nail on the head. I think, maybe you should be trying to listen to understand, not listen to respond. That should be the key point.
Okay, now we do have a comment. So I'm going to go ahead and allow this person to come on. Did you want to raise your virtual hand or did you want to come on screen? It's totally up to you. Uh-oh. Now I can't find the person. I can't find her.
Just give us a moment. We're working on spotlighting now.
Okay, just a minute. Hi.
Hello.
Hi, thank you so much for allowing me to join this conversation. I wanted to share kind of my perspective and thoughts about autism, if you allow me to, and some personal experiences I wanted to share as well and see if I could get your feedback. I worked as an interpreter at a school for a deaf school, and there was a situation that didn't happen to me, but it happened in the area that I was working with another deaf interpreter. So I just wanted to feel that story. And so there were a lot of hearing interpreters at that school. And it was the first time that they actually pulled in a deaf interpreter to work there as well. And the hearing interpreters were saying, we don't need a deaf interpreter at this school. We're fine. We can interpret without them. And I think they forgot that the interpreter that was deaf is very, very valuable, especially in that setting with deaf students, right? Having a deaf interpreter would be very, very beneficial. And so they forgot that, this deaf interpreter uses ASL every single day. Hearing people usually just use it at work, right? And you only use it when you clock in and clock out. But our language as a deaf community is something we use all the time, and it's innate, which is something that interpreters don't have. They have to learn our language through school and classes. So saying that you didn't need the deaf interpreter was really out of line. And then think about the deaf students. When they look up to the deaf interpreter and as a role model and as a language model for the deaf students. Think of all the hats that a deaf interpreter wears and how beneficial it is for them to be in that setting. So I think hearing interpreters need to learn to work together. There is room enough for all. I think sometimes hearing interpreters are so just used to working with each other that when they see another deaf person come in that's an interpreter as well, they forget the skill and the type of benefits they have being there. And not only for the language itself, but also for the students that they're working with. And that can be an example of autism is oppressing deaf interpreters in that space of interpreting. So I just wanted to share that has happened at deaf schools around the country. And I think sometimes people don't think about that. It also can apply to medical situations, but think about the type of impact a deaf interpreter can have in a school for the deaf. And there's really no excuse for hearing people treating them that way. So I just wanted to share that. And this is Andrea. Thank you so much for sharing that. I think so often interpreters are
Yes,
used to taking the lead in the
exactly.
field, right?
We're
Being in the
used to
forefront.
that.
And now a deaf interpreter is in the forefront. And to be honest, sometimes it has to be a humbling experience for them to allow the deaf interpreter to take the lead. So I
Yeah,
appreciate that that deaf interpreter was able to do that. Yeah, I just wanted to share that that does happen in places around the country.
thank you. You know, that's really common. That's something we do face. And granted, there's always more layers, and you might always feel like, well, what do you mean? Am I inadequate or no? Or maybe it's not the case at all. And many hearing interpreters say, oh no, there are no complaints about deaf people. No, no, I'm fine. I'm fine. I don't need. But many of us deaf people have fears that if, I upset you, I might lose my access. And so I just tolerate things and I just smile and say, no, 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 it's fine, even though it's not. I think if we're working together, we will definitely be more successful.
That is
And
so true. Bucky, did you want to say something?
yeah, and I think that the fear of losing their jobs, like personally, I can really empathize with that. But really, interpreters are not dumb, right? They know that they need the team. They know that's important. They think, hey, I'm going to lose my job here. But no, that's not truly the aspect here. I think really we have to look at their behavior as sort of keeping that gatekeeping intact. And so, if this interpreter doesn't have the best skills, so to speak, they sort of stay behind that gate and they take these jobs and they're not visible. And so now letting these deaf interpreters onto their turf, so to speak, is
Yeah,
dangerous in effect.
And it's interesting because deaf interpreters are so skilled with the language, they can look at other interpreters and say, now, hold on, you're not facilitating this communication clearly. We can improve this way
right.
or that. Whereas hearing people sometimes will make mistakes and not even realize it. And then, of course, the students don't even realize mistakes are being made. A deaf interpreter being in that setting now can see the difference. They can clarify things that have been miscommunicated. So like you mentioned, gatekeeping, even for medical appointments, sometimes, you may think the medical interpreter, it's not really important, but you don't realize that the next appointment might be something very urgent. It might be life or death, it might be something that, and people are saying, well, I don't need a deaf interpreter in this situation, but you have no idea how important or critical that interpreter could be. So you're taking away that access. Why are you taking a job away from a deaf person? Could do that. We are trying to provide a service. And so we are ready to serve, and hearing people need to be a part of that team. I want to thank you so much, Maria, for joining this and joining the fight as a deaf interpreter and being a part of this field. Thank you so
Great to
much.
meet
And it was so
you.
nice
Thank
to meet you
you.
virtually.
Great
Yes,
to
thank you
meet
for being here.
you. Mm.
Yeah, Bucky?
So I kind of want to throw a wrench here at the moment. So another question is, in terms of how we respond to that particular situation of the interpreter who took advantage of an opportunity. But now let's think about a situation of in terms of if the interpreter were white, right? We have this situation with a black interpreter with a deaf person. Now we have a white interpreter with a deaf person. So the question is, if this interpreter were white, how would this response differ? And how would the community's response differ is the question. And again, thinking about a black interpreter taking a potential opportunity from a white deaf person, would we then amp up the vitriol towards that interpreter?
Well, I mean, and I think, oh my gosh, I can just see it would be over at that point. I think, like for example, like with the idea of white supremacy and so forth, with having a black president, RID, all the white supremacists were like,
Sound is something that I look
oh,
at as a tool. I mean,
I mean, they, like, oh, they're worried that deaf people are going to die and all this stuff. And I mean, it was a huge, huge mess. And then it caused, the president to step down. And it does have a different impact, definitely, when you have that exacerbated emotion.
I wholeheartedly agree. I think being Black and being an interpreter and working in a white space can be very, very challenging. That person is fighting for their right to be in that space, which definitely can exacerbate the situation. So interpreters in general are used to being the face of ASL. Let's just be
Yeah.
honest. So now you have a deaf person, plus they're Black and they're the face. I'm not surprised if some white interpreters don't wear their racism, but they may feel it on the inside, right? Now they may feel it. You just have to accept that that's a fact.
And I agree 100% with that. And I can say, like, in fact, I have recognized with hearing interpreters, even deaf white consumers respond differently with me, even though I'm like brown skinned and I'm Khmer, but they treat me differently than a white deaf interpreter. And they might even say, like out loud, and not just once, several times, oh, well, what are you here for? Why are you here? You're not allowed here. You're an illegal. You can't be a deaf interpreter. And I said, oh, whoa, what do you mean by I'm an illegal? Oh, wait, so you think I'm an immigrant or something? No, I'm a US citizen. I'm allowed to work here. It's fine. So, in a situation like that, just look at the concept in that. The response from the consumers are even different. And that's deep. Like, I remember working for a company in a mentorship program, and it was a one-time incident. There was a white deaf interpreter who made a comment about decision making and their interpreting, and it just so happened they did use an African American stereotype, but the purpose was to elaborate to the deaf consumer to understand things more clearly. So I said, hey, I checked in afterwards. I said, are you willing to have a conversation with me? Because I have some questions for you. I just want to, pick your brain about something. And it became, just a huge disagreement, saying, well, no, I learned this and I want to provide culture. And I said, but do you know where that deaf customer came from? Do you know their background? So if you know which culture it is that you should be elaborating, then how do you make that match if you don't know where the consumer's background is? So I would say that's a stereotype that you're putting out there. And so they just kind of chuckled, and you could see that they were uncomfortable at that moment because I called them out because I saw it. And I just wanted to let them know. And then it ended up being a whole nother thing, and they got very upset. They lost their job and announced on social media, do not accept a deaf mentor. Do not let them come to your job because you could get in trouble and XYZ. Be aware. And that went out to the universe. So yes, there is racism, and it's so hard to work with. You have the hearing people and deaf and then white interpreters. There's multiple challenges there.
Wow. I think that this is just so human behavior is so fascinating to me, but it's so odd at the same time, to be honest, because we try to justify the logic between, judging someone based on the color of their skin, thinking whites are superior. I just really think the concept is so egregious for me. It really is. I just don't understand it. I don't understand. But I think, again, it comes down to us. We need to analyze ourselves, think of our power, our privilege, our intersectionality, our identities, and help us to take a step back and think before we react. Think before we respond or do something. And I think that will help mitigate harm and make it less in our community.
Indeed. Do the work.
Do the work. There you go. That's the statement.
Don't just talk the talk, walk the walk.
Yes. I also want to acknowledge this topic may be triggering for some of you. And for you who came tonight, I want to really say thank you so much for being open to this dialogue and delving into how we as a community can do better, be better, shift better for the future. I think it's so important to be here and have this conversation.
And then another thing I want to add to also self-care. Yes, you have to be accountable. It could lead to some negative feelings and triggers. Please be sure that you provide self-care, because without that, you will just exhaust yourself before you know it. So please take care of yourselves.
And to add, allow the dialogue to happen, right? We have to
exactly.
I think that's critical.
Absolutely.
We can't continue to have these conversations internally and in back channels. We need to allow this dialogue to open up to the greater community so that we have community processing as well.
And be willing to have that uncomfortable conversation. You have to be open to that. Oh, Andrea, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, I just feel that, it's such a shame and it's unfortunate with what happened with that interpreter taking that opportunity from the deaf client. That's the worst example of what interpreters should not do. And so now it can be very negatively impacting to the deaf community. And it's not easy for everyone. And especially for that person being that example of, someone that's looked at as what not to do. I believe at the same time, we can use that as a lesson to better our community, to better our profession, to learn from this. It's hard to have the hard conversation, but if we learn from our mistakes, it is worth it in the end. We all fuck up. We all do things that are wrong. It's so important just not to repeat those mistakes again. I think that's the key lesson, really, is to look inward and say, you know what? I'm going to allow other people to learn from my mistakes.
Yeah, just be better.
Right. Be a better person tomorrow as opposed to the person you are today.
Exactly. If anyone wants to have any last final comments before we wrap up, we would welcome those. This has really been a very heart wrenching topic for us, talking about people of color. It comes with so many various identities, and seeing my community and the deaf community, as well as the interpreting community, it can be very, very hard and difficult to have this conversation for me personally. So I want to appreciate everyone who was here with us tonight, being willing to be part of this really engaging conversation.
Yes.
And Ram, do you have any last final comments for our audience? Any final thoughts, advice, feelings? Let's turn it over to you.
I feel like I've covered most of what I wanted to. I think it's just, be willing to accept feedback, being able to unpack and look within, to have these discussions. Don't just point the finger at other people. Call people out, call people in. Don't shut them out and walk away over one mistake and then you cast them aside. No, be supportive. Give them space and time and see if there's a result. See if they're willing to make progress, and hopefully growth will be change for the better. And so that's my hope.
Oh, we do have another question. So let me pull that up. And the question is, how can we be a better ally as a hearing interpreter who is also a POC? What would be your advice to be a better ally as a POC interpreter for the deaf community? Such a good question.
It is.
And there's so many layers to that, but Rob, do you want to answer that initially?
Okay. I think that's a rather broad question, but I think in general, what I could say is, because I really can't give a specific answer that you might be looking for. I think the key is to listen and, pay attention to the deaf community and try to figure out how to apply what you learned to your own actions and live up to the vision that you want. Continue to be supportive. And those are some just general suggestions.
And as a POC interpreter myself, I think it comes with a lot of layers and responsibilities. As a hearing interpreter, POC, it can be very difficult. And so the most important thing I would say is to just be there for the community. Be there no matter what. As a POC, as a deaf person, just be there for the community and really go through it together. Instead of isolating yourself and standing as an oppressor and saying, well, I'm hearing, that's just who I am, that's just my privilege. As a POC, as an advocate of the deaf, as an ally, go through the process together and go back to being someone with a deaf heart. I believe that's what an ally is. It's not thinking of allyship. It's more thinking of, do you do the work? Do you talk the talk and walk the walk? That is the definition of an ally by your example.
Be willing to show up, not just adhere to the system and people just saying, well, that's just the way it is. No, stand up to it. admit that the system is not perfect and that there are many places that it needs to be fixed, and people will remember you.
You know, just thinking about the context of a hearing white interpreter in terms of their behavior and their actions that may be different from a hearing interpreter who is a person of color. And the question
Right.
is that right? Right? Do I have to change the way that I present based on the interpreter, whether they're white or a person of color? That's something to think about.
And I want to respond to that. I know we're a little bit over time, but this is an important question that was just raised. It says, how do you feel about BIPOC deaf interpreters inviting white interpreters into a space and they're chosen to interpret over the BIPOC? How do we feel in those situations? That's a question in the chat. I think it's a very interesting question to engage with.
But it does happen, and it has several times, and it does give me an uneasy feeling, but not just for the deaf. I can see hearing people doing the same thing. I think for those kinds of questions, how do I feel? I'm not really sure where or why people get to that feeling and say, forget it, I'm going to just choose this one person. So it does give you that bad taste in your mouth, though.
Okay, so I'm thinking that this is more about coming from a place of not race per se, but skill for the assignment. Okay. So sometimes the job necessitates a skill that is necessary for that environment. And then also you might internalize racism without realizing it. So that can happen sometimes. Why are white interpreters being preferred over BIPOC interpreters? So that's a person that needs to ask themselves that question.
And that's the reason why I feel the way, because if the person does meet the skill level, and I think oftentimes if a BIPOC interpreter doesn't have the skill level, when do they have the opportunity to develop those skills? White people have plenty of opportunity. Why not allow that opportunity for growth? And I think that's what triggers me to feel so unsure about it.
Right. And so something that is connected to this, we have a particular situation where an agency, they just felt it was very important to watch this interpreter, this person of color interpreter. They wanted to ensure that there was, interpreter clarification. They wanted to ensure that this interpreter matched the consumer, but it had nothing to do with the specific context, right? So they were filtering based on
I have a problem with that.
And so they feel like, well, in our modern time, we have to be so careful. That's how they feel as an agency. We just have to make sure that my agency doesn't get in trouble, so to speak. And so that just, it feels a little bit related because, we have to look at skill, but we also have to pave opportunities for BIPOC interpreters. And there's so many layers here, I have to say.
I feel like that's more of a gap of information or gap of knowledge to really understand how to make those matches. That's my opinion on that.
Like I said, there's so many layers to this, and it's just not a one size fits all. That's a very great question, though. Thank you so much for asking it. And I believe it's hard to respond to the question without having all the information regarding that specific assignment, because each assignment is different and comes with its own variables. But in general, I would say that's not okay. That type of thinking is not acceptable. But again, we have to think, am I oppressing others? Is it thinking about who has the best skill for the assignment? So there's so many layers to that. But again, I just want to thank you all for coming. Oh, go ahead.
And then also just want to thank the 3 interpreters who provided their services.
Yes, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Thank you so much. And everyone have a wonderful night. Goodbye.
Have a fantastic evening. Goodbye.